Chapter 9. The corporal was out of breath. "A hard climb for an old man," he said. "You bring the pigs, too?" "We fatten 'em up on the way," said Papa. "Waste not, want not." "Of course," said the corporal, and he looked about him. "Mountains," he said. "The transhumance. It must be the same the world over, I expect. But back at home we only have the cows and the horses. The horses, they are like yours, except they have flaxen manes and tails. Halflingers, we call them. But just like you do, we take them up all into the high pastures in the summer. Except, of course, we do not all go together." Papa was quick to explain. Too quick, Joe thought. "The shepherds will part them up this evening," he said, "and they'll take them off to their own mountainside. Every shepherd has his own mountainside." The corporal nodded. "Of course," he said, "of course. Back at home," he went on, and he was looking straight at the hut as he spoke. "Back at home, it is just the men who drive the animals, and their dogs, of course. No women, no children. You must have had almost the entire village up here." Hubert came running across to the corporal and looked at him through his binoculars from a meter away. The corporal smiled and winked into the binoculars. "Hello, Hubert," he said, but Joe could see that he was still interested in the hut. "And you passed the whole summer alone up here?" Papa leaned back against the door of the hut. "That's right," he said. "Do you mind if we fill our water bottles?" the corporal asked. "Go ahead," said Papa. "Hans," said the corporal, holding out his water bottle and pointing to the spring. He turned back to Papa. "So you have to do all the work yourself, the milking, the shepherding, the cheese-making?" "Everything," said Papa, watching the soldier as he crouched down beside the spring. "I take the donkey down to the village once a week with the cheeses, pick up the supplies, and I'm back up here in time to milk them in the evening." A shutter squeaked and banged open in the wind. The soldier at the spring looked up at once, and then looked again, his eyes squinting. He screwed the top of the water bottle on and stood up, his eyes still on the shutter that swung back and forth, now on its own hinges. He began to walk towards it. No one moved a muscle. "It must be hard work," said the corporal, but Papa was not listening. His face was frozen. Joe could feel the queen in his pocket and squeezed it until his eyes watered. He looked up at the corporal, and their eyes met. In that moment, the corporal knew and understood. Joe was sure of it. "Hans!" the corporal shouted. Hans hesitated, looking at the window to the corporal and back again. "Hans!" said the corporal, more quietly this time. "Kommen Sie zurück. Nix da." The soldier shrugged his shoulders and came back. The corporal turned to Papa. "You should get that mended," he said. "If you do not, it will blow off in the first storm." And then he spoke to everyone. "Lieutenant Weissman has sent me out to escort you all back," he said. "We shall need to start down now, I think. I am sure you know that you must be back inside your homes before curfew." No one needed to be asked twice. Families gathered together briefly to say goodbye to their men, and then they followed the soldiers past the piggery and the donkey shelter and made their way down towards the tree line. The last Joe saw of Papa, he was standing at the door of the hut, the other shepherds around him. Joe lifted his hand to wave, and then a rock was between them, and he could see them no more. With Christine on his shoulders, Hubert walked beside Joe all the way down the mountain. Hardly anyone spoke. The soldiers walked on ahead of them, stopping every now and then to let them catch up. Once at the river, everyone stopped to rest, and Joe looked around for the corporal. He was sitting on his own, his back to everyone, tugging at the grass beside him. Hubert went to sit beside him and showed him how he could make rude noises by blowing the grass through his thumbs. The corporal seemed preoccupied and disinterested, and after a few moments Hubert got up and moved away to blow on his grass alone. Joe wanted to go right up to the corporal there and then to thank him. He wanted to tell everyone what the corporal had done. If only they knew what he knew, they would be carrying him shoulder high into the village. As it was, when they got back home, they all vanished into their houses, bursting with the news of their success. Joe could hear it now, the same story in every house, about how the children would be over the border tonight and away, and about how they'd had a bit of luck up by the hut, but that it otherwise had all gone according to plan. And sure enough, that was precisely the story Grandpère told Maman as soon as they got in. "One look through that window," said Grandpere, "and that would have been it. Makes me sick to think about it. If the corporal hadn't picked that moment to call the soldier away, then God knows what would have happened." "Perhaps it was the prayer Benjamin said this morning," said Maman. "Maybe," said Grandpere. Joe thought then of speaking up. He had to force himself not to. What the corporal had done, he'd done for him. It was personal, and it was private, and he could tell no one, not ever. The village always seemed an empty, echoing place that first morning after the transhumance, and sad, too. But the mood when Joe reached school that morning was jubilant. Everyone had been told time and again never to talk about the escape, never ever to mention it. But they still gathered in conspiratorial huddles and relieved their exploits. Joe was uneasy, though, and he had good cause. From dawn they'd been expecting word that the children had crossed safely over into Spain. It had all been arranged. The widow Horcada was going to let them know just as soon as Benjamin got back. But there had been no word. "No news is good news," Grandpere kept saying, rather too often, Joe thought. All through first lesson that morning, Joe looked out the window and tried to convince himself that nothing could have gone wrong. After all, what could go wrong between the hut and the border? So close you could spit into Spain. That's what Grandpere always said. Joe squeezed the queen in his pocket and closed his eyes for a moment. He tried to pray, but he couldn't. He tried to obliterate his worst fears, but he could not. The night had been pitch black and perfect. Papa was there to guide them over. They couldn't have got lost. They'd go the silent way, walking on the grass, not across the scree. There'd be someone waiting for them on the other side to take the children on into Spain. Benjamin and Papa would be back in the hut by midnight at the latest. Papa had said as much. They were going to rest for an hour or two before the descent, and Papa was going to bring Benjamin down as far as the river and let him go on back to Widow Horcada's house alone. Nothing could have gone wrong. No news was good news. Please, God. "Joe?" Monsieur Audap was coming towards his desk. "I don't think you've been entirely with us this whole morning, Joe. If you've seen that view out of that window once, you've seen it 1,000 times. Now, whilst I appreciate you are not a natural mathematician—" The door burst open, and Hubert was standing there, his mouth open, straining to make intelligible words out of his grunting. He was beckoning frantically. "Stay where you all are," said Monsieur Audap. "I'll be back in a minute." But Joe was out the door even before he was. Hubert took his arm and ran with him down toward the square. By the time they reached it, Joe expected to find it full of the cave children, but it was empty. There were heads at every window, and people standing in the street craning to look. Joe was about to run on, but a hand held him back firmly. Monsieur Audap was at his side, and the school children had filled the street behind him. Madame Soleil came out of her shop, wiping her hands on her apron, and Joe saw her look up the street and then rush back inside and shut the door. The next moment her face appeared pale in the window, and now Joe could see what she had seen. There was a soldier in the front and one on either side, and there was someone else between them, but Joe could still not make out who it was. And then he knew who it was, and his heart turned cold. It looked like one person at first, but it was two. Benjamin was carrying Leah, her arms wrapped around his neck, her head buried in his shoulder. He stopped now and put her down. He crouched down and straightened her coat, talking to her all the while. Then he took her hand, and they walked slowly into the square, which was now filling with the silent people. From behind Joe came the sound of running boots. Lieutenant Weissman, the corporal, and a dozen soldiers pushed their way through the schoolchildren and into the square. Soldiers fanned out all over the square, driving the crowd back. One of the soldiers saluted as Lieutenant Weissman came up. Joe could understand nothing of what was being said, but he heard one word repeated over and over again: "Juden." The lieutenant walked across to Benjamin and looked at him and then down at Leah. "You are Jews?" he asked. Benjamin smiled and nodded. "We are," he said. "May we sit down, please? The little girl is very tired, and so am I." The corporal pulled out 2 chairs from outside the cafe, and they sat down side by side, still holding hands. Lieutenant Weissman looked around him. "Is Monsieur Sarthal here?" he said. Monsieur Sarthal stepped out of the crowd. "Monsieur Sarthal," said the lieutenant, "I must get these 2 down to the station at once. They'll never get there on foot. My horse is lame, so I will need a horse, a donkey, whatever you can find." Monsieur Sarthal nodded. "You heard what the lieutenant said," he said. "He needs a donkey or a horse." No one spoke. "For God's sake, do you want them to have to walk?" "They can have mine," said Monsieur Audap, and then he turned to Joe. "Fetch her, Joe, will you?" he said quietly. "You know where to find the saddle." Joe hesitated. "Fetch her," said Monsieur Audap, an edge to his voice. Laurent went with him. "What happened?" he said as they ran up the hill. "What went wrong?" "I don't know," said Joe. "I don't know." It was all he could do to hold back his tears. They found Monsieur Audap's mare and saddled her up together. Laurent held her mane as Joe slipped the bridle over her ears. "What'll they do with them?" said Laurent. "One of those camps," said Joe. The crowd parted as they led the horse into the square. Benjamin was talking urgently to Leah, smoothing her hair. They looked up and saw Joe coming towards them. Neither showed any flicker of recognition. Joe held the horse as Benjamin mounted from a chair. The corporal handed Leah up to him, and she sat clutching the mane, Benjamin's arm around her. "You'll be escorted to the train by the corporal," said the lieutenant. "And after that?" "It's not my concern," said the lieutenant, and he stepped aside. A soldier took the reins from Joe. Joe looked up at Benjamin, who held out his hand. "Jekuya," he said. Joe took his hand. "Jekuya," Benjamin said again. For a moment, Leah's eyes met Joe's and held them. The lieutenant was frowning at him. "Do you know them?" he said. Joe shook his head. "Of course not," said Benjamin. "We know no one here, and no one knows us. The boy brought me a horse, and I simply said thank you. Is that not permitted for a Jew to even say thank you?" Joe watched them being led away, the horse's hoofs slipping on the cobbles as she was led across the square, down the hill, and out of sight. Monsieur Audap tried to gather the children together and take them back to school, but many, like Joe, drifted away homewards. As he walked home through the empty streets, he gleaned from the squeeze of Benjamin's hand, from the single word Benjamin had been able to say to him, all that he had wanted to say and was not able to say without betraying him. The news had reached home before him. Papa was sitting huddled over the table, head in his hands. He looked up as Joe came in, his eyes full of tears. "You mustn't go blaming yourself," said Maman. She prized his hands away from her face and kissed them. "We all did what we could. Everyone did." "Did we?" said Grandpère fiercely. "I was in the square just now. There were over 100 of us and just 22 of them. And we just stood and watched them take them away." He looked away to hide his face. "What happened, Papa?" said Joe. "The children, did they not get away?" "Oh, yes," said Papa. "We got them away just like we planned. Like clockwork it was. We were up there at the border before midnight. Only one thing went wrong. The little girl." "Leah," said Grandpère. "She wouldn't leave 'em," Papa went on. "I tell you, Joe, I've never seen anything like it. The strength of the girl. There wasn't much of her, but she clung to Benjamin like she would drown if she let go. So we had to bring her back with us to the hut. There was nothing else we could do. Even then we weren't too unhappy. We had a glass together in the hut, Benjamin and me, to celebrate it was, before we came down. The little girl was tired, of course, so I sat her on the donkey and we set off." He drank down his glass and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "But then it happened. I thought it was a boar. There was sort of a snorting and then a growling. You couldn't see anything, not at first. It's funny, though. Benjamin seemed to know at once what it was, almost like he was expecting it. He shouted some sort of warning to the little girl. I don't know what he said, but I understood soon enough when that bear came lumbering out of the trees. He came right at us. Benjamin stood his ground and faced him, but the donkey took off, the little girl screaming loud enough to wake the dead. I was running like the donkey was. You don't stand and fight a bear. But when I turned round, I saw Benjamin throwing stones at it and shouting at it, and the bear was backing away. I couldn't believe it. And then I remembered all about that bear cub you told me about, the one that Benjamin brought up. And I put 2 and 2 together, so I started throwing stones at him too. He was up on his hind legs and waving his paws like he was boxing, and we were just hitting him again and again, and still he came on. Then it seemed like he'd had enough of it, and he went down on all fours and just walked off. All the time we could hear the little girl crying and screaming somewhere behind us, and the donkey braying down in the valley. I went after the donkey. Benjamin went after the little girl. Papa shook his head. I should have never left him. I was gone a few minutes. Took me a bit of time to calm the donkey down. I was leading him back through the trees towards them. The little girl, she was still crying like she would never stop, and he was trying to comfort her. Then suddenly there were torchlights and shouting, and there were soldiers everywhere. And what did I do? I crouched there in the darkness like a frightened rabbit, that's what I did. And I stayed there until I was sure they had gone. What does that make me, eh? You've got a coward for a father, Joe. Joe put out his hand to touch Papa's shoulder. He said thank you, said Joe. Benjamin, he said to thank you. Papa looked away. Someone's got to go up there and tell Alice, said Grandpere. And I don't know if I can, not on my own. I'll come, Maman said, standing up and wrapping her shawl about her. Joe, you can stay here and look after your sister. She put her arms around Papa's neck and kissed him on the top of his head. You'd better get yourself back up the mountain. Those sheep won't milk themselves. She took Grandpere's arm. Come on, she said. Let's get this over with. In the days that followed the exodus of the cave children, an unseasonal fog settled over the village, and it matched perfectly the mood of the place. Yet even when it cleared and they began to cut the hay, the village seemed incapable of lifting itself out of its gloom, and that in spite of the news of the war, it was all good. France was being liberated from the north and from the south, too. The end of the occupation could not be far off now, but few in Lescone could rejoice in it. No one spoke to the German soldiers anymore. When people saw them coming, they turned their backs and walked away. The soldiers scarcely ever ventured into the cafe, and if they did, they were met with a hostile silence that soon drove them out. There was no more nostalgic talk of old battles, no more sweets for the children. Joe did all he could to avoid the corporal, not because he blamed him for what had happened to Benjamin or Leah. He knew that none of that was the corporal's doing, but because he had come at last to see him as a man in the uniform of the enemy. A good and kindly man, Joe had no doubt of that, but nonetheless an enemy too. It was a confusion he did not wish to confront. Their eyes met several times across the street, but they never spoke. Not until the evening Joe ran into the church porch to escape a torrential downpour, his jacket over his head. When he pulled it off, he saw the corporal standing beside him in the shadows. "Hello, Joe," he said. Joe made to move away. "No one can see us, Joe." The corporal took off his cap and shook it. "Hubert gave me back the binoculars." "I know," Joe said. "But the little cup he made, I shall keep it. I shall take it home when it is over, and it will not be long now, I think. It will remind me of this place, of him, of you." "They were taken to one of those camps, weren't they?" said Joe. The corporal said nothing. "But why?" said Joe. "What for? What did they do?" The corporal took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "I have no answers, Joe," he said. "I know no answers, no reasons. I have thought much of that man and the little girl, and still I do not understand." "He was a friend of mine," said Joe fiercely. "They both were. They were hiding up in the mountains, and do you know why? He was waiting for his daughter to come so they could escape together into Spain. He wouldn't leave without her." "The little girl? She was his daughter?" "That was Leah," said Joe. "His daughter's called Anya. He was so sure she would come, but she never did." The corporal put his cap on and made to move away. "That day up in the hut," Joe went on, "you knew, didn't you?" The corporal nodded. "I thought there was someone inside," he said. "Someone, or maybe something you did not want me to see." "There was," said Joe. "There were 12 Jewish children, and they escaped. All except Leah. They escaped!" And he did not try to disguise the triumph in his voice. Well, well, said the corporal. I suppose that is something. Auf Wiedersehen, Joe. And pulling up the collar of his coat, he walked out into the rain. They were carting in the hay a few days later when Joe thought he heard the sound of distant thunder. Maman brought the horse to a halt, and Grandpère held up his hand. It wasn't thunder. It was drumming. It was Hubert drumming. Christine screamed at being left behind, but Joe ran on ahead anyway. As he ran down through the streets, he was aware that there were others running with him, all around him now, and the drumming echoed off the walls of the houses, so that it seemed as if Hubert must be beating a dozen drums. In the square, they were all hugging each other and crying. "They've gone!" Joe heard. "The Germans have gone!" The bells were ringing, and Monsieur Sarthal was leaning out of the window of the mairie and fumbling with a faded tricolor that would not run out of its pole. But when it did, it was greeted with such a din of clapping and cheering that Joe couldn't hear what Laurent was shouting in his ear. Not at first. "Hubert!" he shouted. "Look at Hubert!" Outside the cafe, they were drinking straight from the bottles, arms around each other and dancing, and Hubert was standing by his drum and drinking wine as if it were water. He finished the bottle and raised his hands in the air, laughing till the tears ran down his face. When Joe saw him next, he was dancing around the square with Christine. It was a wild gallop, more than a dance, but Christine was loving it. Monsieur Sarthal stood on the war memorial and tried to make a speech, but no one would listen, so he gave up and sang the Marseillaise instead, bottle in hand. By the end of it, everyone was linking arms and singing with him. Then Father Lassalle was running in amongst them. "Quick!" he shouted, tugging Monsieur Sarthal by the arm. "Quick! It's Hubert! He's in the churchyard! I think he's gone mad! He's trying to push away one of the tombstones!" And Joe knew at once which tombstone. He was there before anyone. The tombstone was ajar, and Hubert was nowhere to be seen. He didn't need to look in to see if Grandpère's rifle was still there. It would be gone. He knew it. From the graveyard wall, he could see Hubert springing down the hillside, the rifle held above his head, and on the winding track below the village, the gray column of German soldiers, led by Lieutenant Weissman on his horse. "Don't, Hubert! Don't!" he called, and he saw Lieutenant Weissman swivel in his saddle and look upwards. "Don't shoot!" Joe cried. "Don't shoot!" Hubert had stopped. He was aiming the rifle at the soldiers. Joe vaulted the wall and ran screaming down the hill, waving his hands. He leapt the ditch and blundered through the hedges, and all the while he called out, "Hubert! Hubert! Don't! Don't!" He never saw the shooting. He tripped over a root and was picking himself up when he heard it. There were just 2 shots. He looked where Hubert had been and could not see him. Lieutenant Weissman was running up the hill towards him, a pistol in his hand. Joe found Hubert lying on his back in the long grass, the rifle still grasped in his hand. His eyes were looking at the sun, but not seeing. Joe looked at the blood on the grass by his shoe, and thought of the bear lying stretched out on the chairs in the square all those years before. The blood of a man was the same red as the blood of a bear. A shadow came over him, and he looked up. Lieutenant Weissman was looking down at him. He crouched down beside Hubert and felt his neck. "A pity," he said, and he stood up. "I am sorry, very sorry." "He didn't mean it," said Joe as the lieutenant walked away, and then he was shouting after him, "He didn't mean it! He didn't mean it!" A few months later, the war was over. The men from the prisoner of war camps came home, or most of them did. Everyone waited for some word of Benjamin and Leah, but there was no word. Instead came the first dreadful rumors that there were camps, concentration camps, where Jews and others had been systematically murdered. Even when there were pictures in the newspapers and reports in the wireless, Widow Horkata refused to believe it. Joe clung to Benjamin's own maxim. "Wait and pray," he had said. "Wait and pray." This, often alone in the cold church, he would cry into his hands, for he somehow knew that his prayers were too late. Meanwhile, Monsieur Audap had been making inquiries. It seemed that Benjamin and Leah had been first taken to Gurs concentration camp, about 30 kilometers away. From there, they'd been sent on to Auschwitz. Auschwitz was a death camp, he said. There were only a few survivors, and Benjamin and Leah were not amongst them. Like millions of Jews, they would not be coming home. Grandpere broke the news to Widow Horcata and was a constant source of comfort through her dark and grieving days. It was to no one's great surprise when the two of them got married just before the winter snows set in. Grandpere moved out of the house to start all over again, as he put it, up at the Widow Horcata's farm. He took the pigs with him, and that pleased Papa, who could never take to them. Joe left school the next summer and became a full-time shepherd. With only Rolf for company, he took the sheep up to the mountains and lived in the hut as Papa and Grandpere had done before him. Rolf was all the company he needed or sought. He buried himself in his work. It was the only way to forget the gnawing pain inside him. But at nights, asleep in his hut, the faces of Hubert, Benjamin, and Leah haunted his dreams. One Sunday afternoon, with the cheese-making done, Joe was resting on his bed with Rolf beside him. It was the dog who heard the voices first and lifted his head. Then Joe heard Papa coughing and Christine prattling on. They often came up on a Sunday for a picnic. Joe had to steel himself to be sociable. Papa would question him endlessly about the sheep, and Christine would want her ride on the donkey. He was surprised, though, when he heard Widow Horcata's voice, too. He swung his legs off the bed as Grandpere put his head round the door. "Not disturbing you, are we?" he said. Joe blinked in the bright sunlight and held his hand over his eyes so that he could see better. They were all there. Papa was helping Widow Horcata down from her horse, and Maman had the picnic basket on her arm. Rolf was greeting Christine in his usual boisterous way, paws on her shoulders. She staggered back and sat down hard, Rolf on top of her. She laughed, and everyone laughed. "Well, Joe," said the Widow Horcata, shaking out her skirts, "have you lost your tongue? Don't you know how to say hello to strangers?" "Strangers?" said Joe. And then he saw the girl. She was walking towards him. She had red hair that she pushed back out of her eyes and tucked behind her ears. "I'm Anya," she said.